trying my hardest not to do that in this class because I like to respect your time, and also because of the 15-minute time thing. It makes it a little bit harder for me. But okay, I see you all playing on a few things this week. You just have, I say just like it's some little thing, but the discussion board post. Let me go back in here into our Canvas course. Ooh. Oh no, this is the problem with having dogs around. But sorry, let me put on my headset so that you can hear them less, hopefully. Okay, there we go. So it's 5 questions, primarily based on the reading, but I did talk about most of these topics, questions 1 through 4, in Wednesday's class. So if you need to go back and look at the recording, make sure you do that. And actually, I just realized that I haven't posted the recording from Wednesday, so I will do that immediately after our class. I have the video all set ready to go. I just needed to paste the link into our Canvas course, and today we'll be able to answer this last one. And I think this is one a topic I really wanted to cover with you all because it's come back into the news, right? If you go into like Google and you type in the Tuskegee syphilis study, the rest of that, and you look at just the news items for it, there's actually quite a few things that pop up that are recently, right? One, it looks like there's still some people, some survivors of the study, and on top of it, there's been, let's see, where is it? There's been a connection that people are making in terms of the low rates of vaccination in some African-American communities in the US, right? I want to be kind of clear about this. With the low vaccination rates in some Black communities, it's not everywhere, right? And this kind of the history of a bad relationship with medicine, right, and with doctors is not the only reason why some of these numbers are low, but it is a reason, right? It is part of the history of why in certain communities there's a lot of hesitancy to trust the government, and a lot of it is actually this study, because this study actually got a lot of national attention at the time. So I want to make sure and talk about this, right? So the background that you need for the Tuskegee syphilis study is that it was part of a program of the Tuskegee Institute. The Tuskegee Institute was founded by Booker T. Washington because after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, there was a high need for access to medical care for Black communities, right? As I said on Wednesday, part of the problem was that white doctors refused to treat Black patients. They just refused to, right? And some of it was legally coded, right? The segregation, but even when there wasn't a law prohibiting it, right, doctors would just refuse to it. If anybody has read Maya Angelou's autobiography, in the first part of her autobiography, she describes having a toothache, and her grandmother finally got so bad that the grandmother tried to take her to the local white dentist, and the dentist didn't even want to let them come into the building because people would think that he was treating a Black patient, and he just refused to treat a Black patient. And that was very common all over the country. Right. In particular here, the Tuskegee Institute is in Alabama, in Macon County, Alabama. And here, where there was a lot of high rates of disease amongst the Black community. And so there was a significant need for medical care, right? And for research, and just for a lot of community work to be done. So that was part of what the Tuskegee Institute was set up to do. It had some private funding. There was a wealthy sorry, the dogs are being a little bit fussy, but there was a wealthy people who were donating money or were promising to provide money for the research and for the care that the Institute wanted to provide. Right, Macon County, Alabama, this was in like the 1920s, was 82% Black, right? 82% Black. And the income for Black residents of Macon County, Alabama was $1 a day. That's how much they made. Now, you might think, well, okay, this was back then, things were cheaper, blah, blah. Even by the standards of the day, an income of $1 a day was very, very low. Very, very low. Most of the Black residents of Macon County were sharecroppers, right? So they would be renting land from a landowner, but they would also have to be buying tools, seeds, everything they needed to cultivate the land, they were having to pay the landlord for. Right? Now, they usually didn't have the money to pay the landlord up front for like the seed and the tools and a lot of the things that they needed. So they would take out loans from the landowner. And so they were stuck in this cycle of constantly owing the landowner money, right? And so as a result, then there was extreme poverty, a lot of extreme poverty, especially amongst the Black community in Macon County, Alabama. Right? Because of the poverty, that meant that people were not eating well. Right? There was a poor nutrition, poor housing, because if you can't even afford food, how are you going to afford to live in a, in a good home where it's safe, where there isn't, where it's, if you can keep it clean, where, it's going to be healthy. You can't, and it's very hard, right? And so, as is common even today, right, with low income communities, then the health issues were high. There was a lot of health issues amongst the Black community in Macon County, Alabama. One of the high instances of disease, one of the common diseases amongst the Black community in Macon County, Alabama, was syphilis. Right? You don't really hear about syphilis being an issue anymore because we basically found the cure for it. It's something that if you detect early enough, you can cure. Syphilis is curable when detected early enough. It can be contracted either sexually through sexual contact, but you can also be born with syphilis. If the mother has syphilis, usually the children will also have syphilis. So it is not always contracted via sex, right? It can be congenitally attained, which means some people have it from birth because their mother probably had syphilis. Syphilis in particular was a very common disease in the 19th century and the early 20th century, right? So 1800s and then early 1900s. And it is particularly hard to detect because it has stages in it in which you have no symptoms. People had no symptoms. Also, some of the symptoms would be misdiagnosed. Right? And people sometimes would have one symptom of it, so they'd get diagnosed as something else. And by not identifying the syphilis, people would not get treated for what was actually causing the problem here. So I don't mean to gross out people with like these images, but I do think it's important, right? For anybody that is sexually active or plans on ever being sexually active, it's important that you understand and don't panic about some of these diseases. Syphilis, you don't have to worry about so much. It's not something that it's a problem. Even globally, it's not a huge problem because again, we found a way to cure it. But understanding the stages of syphilis helps you understand why it went untreated for so long and why it was a problem for anybody that would get it, but especially in a Black community in which there's little or no healthcare, poor nutrition, poor housing, just bad situation, right? The first stage of syphilis, you get a hard, painless sore in the genital area. So like a bump. Right? It doesn't hurt, but it's there. And then it would disappear. Then the bump just disappears. Because that second stage of syphilis is a stage in which someone who has syphilis has zero symptoms. Zero symptoms. That stage could go on for decades. So for decades, somebody could have syphilis and never have a single symptom of it. Right? That makes it really difficult to diagnose. Right? You have to catch it while there are symptoms. Then though, after decades, potentially decades of no symptoms, then people would have skin growth, running sores, and not just in the general area, everywhere in the body, right? They would visibly have skin issues, bumps, sores, everywhere, right? So at that point, it's really obvious there's a problem. But then there would also be internal problems for going decades without treating syphilis. You would have bone decay and heart damage. At that point, even if you get treated for the syphilis, damage has already been done. The damage has already been done to the body. And then for the final stage of syphilis, people would get brain damage. So that was another thing where, sometimes brain damage caused by syphilis would get diagnosed as a mental disorder. Right? Like somebody would be diagnosed with schizophrenia or with some other mental health problem, be sent to a mental institution and where they would die without ever being treated for the syphilis. Right? It would often also cause blindness. And people with syphilis would often report losing their sight at that stage. It could cause insanity. So again, why it is often misdiagnosed with a mental health problem, paralysis, and eventually death. So people would die of syphilis if one of these other problems, right? If the heart damage, the bone decay, the paralysis, some of these other things, if they didn't kill you, then eventually the syphilis would kill you. But then hopefully it's obvious here why, or it's clear why it was such a problem to diagnose. One of the ways that they would try to treat it in the 19th century was mercury. They would try to treat it with mercury. So the patient would ingest mercury. If I tell you all that I can solve whatever health problem you're having because by giving you mercury, would you consume mercury? No, hopefully no. Right? Mercury would probably do more harm than any good. It would do more harm than any good. It was not a good treatment, but that was the only thing they had in the 19th century and early 20th century to treat syphilis. Oftentimes it was thought of, like in Europe, it was thought of as like an artist disease. A lot of men who were like writers, painters, sculptors, a lot of that ended up having syphilis because they would often have sex with prostitutes. And then if they were married, they would often also infect their wives. In the US, it was not a race-based disease, right? This people of all races and ethnicities could contract syphilis, but there was a lot of stigma around it, and it was often associated with the Black community. Like a lot of white people thought that it was something that Black people primarily got, because they believed Black people were like sexually, like couldn't control sexual urges. Again, this goes back to like those racist ideas that were developed during slavery, right? That continue beyond after slavery has ended in the country. Right? As we've been seeing from the reading and from the class material, there was just a lot of embedded racism that was still present in the medical field. Right? In the 1930s, this study of syphilis is being developed in the Tuskegee Institute, and originally it was all going to be privately funded. Right? A wealthy benefactor was going to fund the study. But then the stock market crash occurs in 1929, and the wealthy benefactor loses most of his money. So he can no longer fund the syphilis study. So the US Public Health Service, the American government, actually takes over funding it. They send some of their experts to the Tuskegee Institute, and they basically take over the study through the Tuskegee Institute. Right? And this is where the racism is really more clear, because initially this was the Black Institute, right? Tuskegee was a Black institute funded by a Black man, and it was meant, the study was meant to help Black men that had been infected with syphilis, right? When the Public Health Service takes over the study, though, they believe that, one, that African Americans were resistant to medical services, and that basically they were too dumb to follow instructions on how to treat it. So they decide that they're not going to try to cure or to treat men infected with syphilis. Right? Instead, they decide that they're just going to study the syphilis. They're going to study the progression of syphilis. They also believed that they had this belief that especially Black men had uncontrollable sexual drives, and that's why they were getting the syphilis. Right? That they're having too much sex, especially with prostitutes, and that was causing them to be infected with syphilis. And when you believe that, right, when you connect that to morality, when you think these are morally inferior people, then you are less likely to want to treat and help those patients. And that was the case here with the US Public Health Services. They have no interest in treating the Black men infected with syphilis. They're wrong in all of their beliefs, right? They're wrong. And in fact, 61% of the cases in Macon County of syphilis were congenital, meaning that 61% of people who had syphilis in this county had syphilis from birth. They hadn't contracted syphilis from sexual contact. It really shouldn't matter, but even by their standards, right? Even if they think like, oh, somebody who contracts this disease by having sex is morally inferior, even by those standards, they were wrong, right? But they're ignoring that, right? They're ignoring that, and instead, the racism is what ends up defining their approach to the study of syphilis. Does that make sense? Like, stop me if it doesn't make sense. So the study itself, it begins in 1932, right? And the goal was to study all the stages of syphilis. The idea was that, it wasn't fully understood at the time, and that scientists believed that the disease looked differently in Black people versus white people, especially Black men. They thought that it looked differently, right? They believed that in the white population, syphilis was primarily neurological, that it mainly affected the brain. And that in Black men, syphilis primarily attacked the cardiovascular system. They were wrong. There is no distinction. Disease does not look different on people based on race, right? My skin color does not dictate how a disease affects me. It just doesn't, right? Skin color has nothing to do with how a skin affects me. Now, there are other elements that can affect, why disease looks different in other people, but it has nothing to do with race or ethnicity, right? It's usually something biological, right? Something that is actually different in someone, or something genetic, right? That explains why a disease that is essentially the same will look different on different people. They thought, though, that it was race, right? So, they their approach then is to look at how syphilis progresses from the very beginning and to the very end. So they engage in this project of testing as many Black men as possible in Macon County, Alabama. Right? They're bringing in as many men as possible to test, and they test them for syphilis. So if a man did not have syphilis, they basically don't want them. Other than for the control group, they are going to use a control group, but mostly they're looking for Black men infected with syphilis. Part of the problem, though, was that they were not using a very reliable test. There wasn't a very reliable test for syphilis in 1932. So some of the men that were showing that the test said were positive for syphilis actually didn't have syphilis. So that's a problem, right? The other huge problem with the whole conception of the study was that they were telling patients, they were telling the men that were testing positive for syphilis that by participating in the study, if they agreed to participate, they would get treated for the disease. I would say you tested positive for syphilis. If you are part of the study, you will get free health care. Except they were never intended to treat anyone. Their goal was not to treat patients. It was not to find a cure or, to help these men at all. The goal was to not treat them and to just see how the disease looked in people over the course of decades. They were planning on going, following these men from the beginning when they were tested for the syphilis until they died. Right. Let's stop there for a second. Why is that a bad thing? Why would it be a bad thing to have a study in which all you're going to do is just watch somebody suffer through a disease?
It's against the code of ethics for human testings and trials.
It is incredibly unethical. You cannot do that today. You cannot ask people to just especially if there's any kind of treatment, to just not treat them. It's just not the way that, these things are done. Now you might think, but doctors need to know what every stage of the disease is, right? It is still unethical. You can't ask people to participate in a study in which you're not going to treat them, right? The way you watch for the progression of a disease is you find people at the different stages. You find people who are infected with syphilis, who are at different stages, and you do observe what the diseases act, how it has affected the patient, but then you treat them, right? And I told you there was no real treatment for syphilis at the time. Mercury was what was used, but that was not offered to any of the members of anyone who participated in the study. But yeah, incredibly unethical. Again, even by the standards, even in 1932, this was unethical, right? This was not supposed to be happening. On top of it, even the whole way the study was set up, it would never, it's not scientific. This was not a scientific study, right? Because one, their test was for syphilis was having false positives, but then the control group, right? In order to really see it, you have to have a control group of people who are not infected with syphilis, right? Because, for example, if heart problems are just common in this community, then can it really be attributed to syphilis, right? You have to have that kind of control group so that you can see what actually is a symptom of syphilis and what is maybe just common because of other problems in the community. So they had a control group of Black men who did not have syphilis. But over the course of the decades in which they were keeping track of these men, some of these men end up contracting syphilis. What the study doctors would do, what scientists did though, when they would find that members of the control group tested positive for syphilis, is they would move them over to the other group. They would move them over to the men that they were tracking. But in order to do that, they had to falsify the documents, because that, you don't do that. In a proper scientific study, you cannot move people from one group into the other. The group has to stay the same. If they test positive for syphilis, then you keep track of that, but they are still supposed to be part of the control group, not the group that is being tested. So just that fact alone completely invalidates the whole study. A study like that, if you try to publish anything where you do that, where you switch people from the control group to the group being tested, would automatically, like, it would never get published, right? It just would never get published. It's not, you have ruined the study if you do that. They did it, and they knew that you couldn't do that. So then they would falsify the documents to say, oh, this person was supposed to be, the whole time they were part of the group being tested. Obviously, there's more ethical problems here than just that, though, right? One, the lack of treatment is an ethical problem. That's not how you run human tests. You don't withhold treatment from patients. You just don't. Another ethical problem here was the lack of informed consent, right? The men who agreed to be part of the study were told that they were going to get free healthcare and that they would get the syphilis treated. That's not, so they're signing the consent forms to be part of the study, but they don't know that the whole study is actually based on them not getting treated. What they would give the men in order to get them to keep coming back to check in over the years with the scientists and the doctors was they would give them Tylenol and they would give them vitamins, so that they got the impression, right? The men that were participating in the study got the impression that they were getting treated, when in reality, it was all, they were giving vitamins and Tylenol, which would not help them at all with the syphilis. Not only that, but the doctors that were doing the study would go to other doctors in Macon County, and they told them, hey, these are the list of men that are participating in a study. You cannot treat them for syphilis. You can, there was that treatment of mercury. You cannot treat them at all. You cannot give them anything that would interfere with our study of the syphilis. That is extremely unethical and wrong, to not just withhold treatment, but to then prevent patients from getting treatment from a different doctor. In the 40s, you had new venereal disease, VD treatment clinics. Venereal disease, it was the term that was used at the time for what we would now call STDs or STIs, right? Sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections. At the time, they called them venereal diseases because it was a problem. Sexually transmitted diseases were a problem in the population. There were clinics that started being established to treat people with these STDs, which syphilis was. Well, what the study doctors would do is they would go to the VD clinics and they would physically remove the men from the clinics. Right? They would give the doctors at the clinic a list of names that you cannot treat these men. And some of the men were already like physically at the clinic. They would be like, nope, you cannot even enter the clinic, so that there's no chance that you're going to get treated for the syphilis. And, there's a chance, the mercury was not effective, but, it's just unethical. just incredibly unethical. At least a third of the participants in the study died directly from syphilis. Like we can clearly attribute their death to the syphilis, right? So they were, to a large extent, the study was responsible for letting these men die. On top of it, we know that 40 of the wives of the study participants, at least 40 of these wives were infected with syphilis. They had not had syphilis before, but now because their husbands are not getting treated for syphilis, they get infected too. And at the very least, these are the cases that we can prove, there were at least 19 children that were born with syphilis-related birth defects. They had birth defects caused by syphilis, all because these men were not getting treated for it. Yeah, it is infuriating for me when I even think about this, right? Like, not only are you not treating the men, but you're allowing them to spread the disease, to infect their families, and it's unethical, right? It's unethical and should have been illegal. But okay, you might thinking, for the purpose of science, right? For the purpose of when the study begins, there wasn't a good treatment for syphilis, right? There was going to be very little anybody could have done for some of these men. So, okay, you might be able to excuse the scientists and the doctors that are conducting the study by saying there was no real treatment for syphilis at the time. Okay, we can kind of give them the benefit of the doubt at the very beginning, even though they're doing extremely unethical things. But we can give them the benefit of the doubt because there was no treatment. Except that in 1943, so this is 11 years after the study starts, doctors discovered that penicillin was a safe and effective treatment for syphilis. It can cure syphilis. Penicillin can cure syphilis. It was curing people. So what some people will ask then, okay, so you maybe had a basis for not treating men in 1932, in the 1930s, but why wouldn't you give these study participants penicillin once it's discovered it can cure syphilis? Right, now you really have an incredible ethical problem here, and potentially a legal problem, right? Because there is a cure, there is a treatment for penicillin from 1943 onward. The study, by the way, doesn't end until, what was it, the 70s, till the 1970s. So what do you think? What do you think was the excuse that the doctors used to why they didn't stop the study once there was a cure for syphilis? If you're gonna put yourselves in the head of some of these doctors, and that, and what they want to do with the study, what the goals of the study are, why wouldn't they just stop the study? I'm putting it in the chat. They just didn't believe it. So they did, because it gets proven. It was very clear, it was proven that that the penicillin was curing syphilis. Yeah, so they couldn't say they didn't believe it because they all believe it. In fact, they go out of their way to prevent anyone that is taking part in their study from getting the penicillin. Yeah, I'm like, you guys are bad at thinking like horrible, horrible doctors, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. A part of it, they say later on when they were interviewed, they said that some of the patients were too far gone. The syphilis was too advanced for the penicillin to help them. Right? That, if you're in the last stage, if you're in the final stage of syphilis, the penicillin is not going to do much because there's already been the brain damage, the bone damage, like it's already affected your body enough that the penicillin is not going to cure what the syphilis did. That was, and so okay, that's true, but there's also evidence here that the government was benefiting from the study financially. They're not worried about treating, right? They're not looking for a cure for syphilis. They're not looking for a treatment to syphilis. All they were doing is watching these men. And they would take blood every time the men would come in. What they do end up doing is developing a reliable syphilis test. Right? When you're only dealing with cadavers of people that have died of syphilis, it's harder to maintain the disease. Like at the time, they didn't have a good way of like keeping the live culture of the syphilis infection. Like they couldn't keep it in a petri dish for very long. So essentially what the study participants become was human incubators of the live virus, so that the doctors had reliable access to the disease and could constantly be, looking at it, tracking at it, and they did develop a test so that they could detect it reliably. The patent for that test was owned by the US government, and they were making money off of that test because they were at the time initially the only ones who had this reliable test for syphilis. Also, part of it, and the doctors, when they are interviewed later, there is evidence that they didn't really care about curing the syphilis in the Black men. Right? They were like, well, these are Black people, so we can just let them continue to suffer from a disease that's curable. Incredibly unethical, right? Incredibly unethical and racist. Especially because the reading does go into a little bit of why this is totally unnecessary. Like to study the progression of the disease, you didn't need this study to do that. There were other ways of studying the disease and of even potentially developing a reliable test that didn't have, where you basically aren't torturing people this way. Okay. And they are they're lying constantly throughout the decades. They're lying to the men who are participating in the study about what they're doing. To do that, as they were really worried initially in the study, they were very worried about the men like moving away or not coming back in for the checkups when they would do the checkups of the men. So they actually hired a nurse. The institute hired a nurse, Eunice Rivers. She had been working as a nurse in a hospital, but she wasn't really allowed to do much because of racist policies of the hospital. So when this opportunity comes up to work for the institute as a scientific assistant, she jumps right on it. She's like, yes, right. This is a promotion for her. She's going to get paid more money. And then she was getting paid at the hospital, and she would actually be working with patients. They put her in charge of tracking all the study participants. So if they moved, she was the one who would go find them. Where have they moved to? Where can we reach them now that they have moved? she was also partly in charge of making sure that they still trusted the doctors in the study, right? One of the things she was allowed to do is tell them that if they died of the disease, that they would get free burials, right? That they would get buried for free. It would be paid for by the institute. Why did the well, it turns out it wasn't really accurate, but the institute was offering this in part because they didn't want people to just die and without an autopsy. Right? They wanted to see exactly what the syphilis had done to the body, and for that, you needed an autopsy. So they would lie to the study participants saying, getting buried is really expensive. We will pay for it if you let us know, if your family lets us know when you die. So they would do that. They would go to the institute and say, so-and-so family member has been part of the institute. Instead of just getting buried like the family expected, they would be autopsied. Right. And we talked about on Wednesday why this was, a lot of African Americans were very weary about that. These people had never consented to donating their bodies in this way. The family didn't know that they were going to be autopsied and studied after death, but they trusted Eunice Rivers. A lot of the families talk about how they trusted her. She was Black, right? A lot of the doctors were white. In fact, I believe all of the doctors that were running the study were white, but here comes this Black nurse, and she's the one that is keeping track and has a connection to the study participants and and their families. So they trusted her. Another ethical problem, or another thing the study does is we're talking about the 40s, right? So you think, okay, what about the world wars? So one of the things that ends up happening was that the study doctors did not want any of the study participants to serve in the military. So they actually, because this is being run by the government, right? This is through the US government, they actually exempt any men in the study from the draft. So if you are part of the study, there was no chance you would get drafted into the military. So these men didn't have to serve during the Second World War. Now, they weren't trying to save these men's lives. What they were trying to do was make sure that the military would not treat the men for syphilis. They were scared that if the men were drafted into the army, right, because the army was very, they want these men to be healthy so that they can actually serve, so they can actually fight, that the army would give them penicillin, make the syphilis go away, and then their study would be ruined. So they actually negotiate so that none of these men had to serve in the military. Now, this could have gone on forever and we might not know about it, except one, the doctors they were presenting their findings, right? Every so often, because they've been treating these men for decades, every so often the doctors would present their findings at the big conferences for medical doctors. There's several big conferences for medical doctors. They would be presenting their information. In addition, people in the community in Macon County, Alabama, started figuring out what was happening. Right? Like, these men were dying, their wives were getting infected, and the whole time they think they're being treated for it. So eventually people notice what is happening, and because the information is getting published by the doctors, people start figuring out what is happening. There were activists that were actively calling for the end of the study. Initially, though, these activists were seen as fringe radical groups and they were ignored. Like people dismiss them. Even people in the community themselves dismiss them because like, oh, it's just a bunch of crazy people screaming about something. And so the activists were ignored. However, a white journalist got a hold of the study. And he reads the study and he's like, wait, what? All kinds of red flags popping up. And then because the study is like, it's published, they've admitted to doing this. They start writing articles about it. The articles get attention, and then other members of the media, start writing on it. So eventually there's enough pressure put on Congress that who was it? It was, I think it was he a congressman at the time? Joe Kennedy calls for a panel in 1972 to investigate the study. The panel is they interview everyone involved. They interview the study participants. They interview the nurse, Eunice Rivers. They interview the doctors, and they record all of it. They're recording everything. They found that the study was unethical and unjustified. They said, they shut it down. They said, you have to stop. On the other hand, that panel, they have the taped evidence of everything. They end up destroying the tapes. Because they didn't want anybody to get punished. There was a potential legal liability for all of the doctors who took part in that study. They could get sued. The nurse could get sued for what she did. But because they destroy that evidence, there are no legal repercussions for anyone involved in the study. The two main people that end up being held responsible for the study was the nurse, Eunice Rivers. She gets criticized everywhere. She is not able to basically work after her role in this is revealed. And it was all being covered in the newspaper. And one other person gets punished, Dr. Henry Foster. He is a Black doctor who in 1995 was nominated by President Clinton to be Surgeon General of the United States. He had nothing to do with the study, but there was an accusation that he had been in a conference where the study was presented, right? So that he knew, the accusation was that he knew that this unethical, potentially illegal study was happening, and he did nothing. Except he had no, so these were the only two people that suffered any consequences for it. Let me stop sharing. Why do you think there was no other consequence for it? Why didn't the doctors get in trouble for it, for doing this terrible study? I should have asked that in the discussion board post to make you talk about it. I've run out of time. So I'll come back to this on Monday. But this story of Tuskegee, it got a lot of attention in the newspapers, and people who survived it, who lived through it, end up telling the story a lot, right? And so that it's still like in a lot of Black communities, this study gets remembered. And in a lot of communities, it killed any trust anybody had left on government medical programs. It just killed all trust. How can you trust somebody who is withholding treatment from you and is actively killing you? It kills all the trust. All right, I'm way over my time, so I'm going to stop the recording and let you all go.